Well, I just wanted to welcome you. If you're new with us, you're coming in the middle, actually right towards the very end of a series through the book of Daniel. Last year wasn't hard enough for us, so we decided that we would begin the year by tackling the book of Revelation, then we'd move seamlessly into the book of Daniel, which anyone who's been around church a while knows that that's a really foolish thing to do. So we're nearly there. We've nearly made it. So this is amazing. One of the things that's been shocking to me, and I didn't even realize this when we embarked upon this journey, is how timely and how relevant the book of Daniel, the lessons of the book of Daniel are for us in our generation. The book of Daniel really is divided into two parts. If you're here at the beginning, I described them. I put a little bit of a summary in your bulletin. It's actually not very much help for you, but at least you can follow some of the scriptures. We're going to spend the next half hour or so, as time permits, to going through really the last half of the book of Daniel, covering a fairly broad sweep of about 4 or 5 chapters. And I wanted to put it in some kind of context, that the beginning of the book of Daniel is the bit of the book of Daniel we all know. It describes really Daniel's life, the miracles. It's mostly, except for chapter 1, it's mostly written in Aramaic, which is the lingua franca, the common language of the day, the language of Babylonia. Written to be understood by the people of the day all around him in Babylon. And then there's a second part of the book of Daniel, really kicking off in chapter 7, which is also in Aramaic, but then moving to chapter 8, where it switches again to Hebrew. And these are the prophetic parts of the book of Daniel. These are the first part is Daniel's life. The second part is Daniel's visions. Daniel's life is a book of miracles. It's the story of the fiery furnace, the story of his 3 friends, the story of interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's nightmares, the story of the writing on the wall, the story of Daniel throwing his windows open and praying boldly and fearlessly, even when the king's edict was that he would be thrown to the lion's den if he did that. That's the first part of the book of Daniel we've been going through. Incredible lessons for all of us. You know, one of the things that the book of Revelation taught us when we were studying that was that in the end times, in the times approaching the end, the unfolding of history, we're all going to be living in Babylon. Not just this city in modern-day Iraq, in the plain of Shinar, in the heart of Mesopotamia, which is the land between the 2 rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates. Not just that city, but this global city, a world system of commerce and thought, where dissent is increasingly suppressed, and where conformity to the narrative of those who hate and despise the God of Daniel has become the requirement for survival. You see, I wish this book were not so relevant in our day. I wish that we could open it and we could just enjoy it for the stories and the history and the human interest that it is. But we can't, my friends, because we're living in Babylon. There's just this week, there's a gym teacher, Christian teacher up in Loudoun County. That's here, that's Virginia. A guy called Tanner Cross, who was suspended from his job this week because he attended a public hearing where the school board had requested public comment on a new policy on encouraging and actually requiring teachers to affirm gender fluidity in elementary school kids. And this Christian gym teacher said he thought it was damaging, he thought it was not scientific, not backed up by the evidence, that it was abusive towards young kids, and it defiles the image of God, and he got suspended from his job here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Which kind of makes the room go a little quiet, because if you know anything about Virginia, I'm from England, we have no rights there, I get that. But Virginia, one of the things you guys are proud about is this is the birthplace of religious freedom. There's a museum in Richmond dedicated to the First Amendment, with this great writing on the walls of freedom of conscience, of religious liberty. But the truth is, here in Virginia, it's looking a whole lot more like Babylon every single day. And so this brings us to Daniel's visions of the future. It's one thing standing in the midst of that, holding the line in the midst of that, holding your testimony and your faith in the midst of that pressure. But you enter to the second half of the book of Daniel, what you see is what happened to Daniel when he was on his knees praying. I've said many times in the last few weeks that you could set your clocks in Babylon by Daniel's prayer times, morning, noon, and night, morning, noon, and night, decade after decade after decade. He'd fling open the windows, and he'd fall on his knees, and he'd pray. It was so predictable. It was so. But what happened to him when he was praying? You see, prayer for Daniel wasn't just a random thing that happened, just something that he did to pass the time. In the place of prayer, God revealed secrets to Daniel that are truly astounding. Some prophetic visions of the future that even to this day theologians do not know what to do with. No one knows what to do with the second half of the book of Daniel, because the accuracy with which it predicts events that happened 100, 200, 300, 400 years after the time of Daniel is so precise that no one knows what to do with that, because who can write history before it happens? Only the God of history. And the problem is that if you don't believe the God of history is real, or the God of history is in charge, you're going to have a problem. Coming to the second part of the book of Daniel. Some of the visions he has are very near term. We read about it in Daniel chapter 8. Beginning of Daniel chapter 8, just the first few verses, we see this emergence of a vision of a ram standing by a canal in Susa, which had two horns, and the ram is charging westward and northward and southward. This ram is kind of trying to expand, it's an image of this empire, the Persian Empire. We read about it later on in chapter 8. I'll give you the reference in verse 20 of chapter 8. Daniel, it describes to Daniel, the ram is the kingdom of Media and Persia. And the goat that then emerges, as I was considering, it says in verse 5, behold, a male goat came from across the west, across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and he came to the ram with the two horns, which I'd seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with a powerful wrath. And I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck him and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power, and the goat became exceedingly great. It's an incredible prophecy. The ram is Persia, the goat is Greece. And Greece is going to just wipe Persia off the face of the map. About 150 years after Daniel wrote these words, exactly that happened. There's a guy that many of you may have heard of. His name was Alexander the Great. And his feet didn't touch the ground. The precision with which, because he moved with such speed through the ancient world. But he died in Babylon at age 32. He had conquered almost half the known world. The most successful military leader the world's ever seen. He just traveled like a flood throughout the ancient world. And was cut off in his prime, just like it predicts here in Daniel chapter 8. And his kingdom is divided into four, between his four generals. And then you go to Daniel chapter 11, and you see these specific predictions in Daniel chapter 11 between two of these kingdoms, the kingdom of Syria and the kingdom of Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Syria and the Ptolemaic Empire in Egypt. And you see them battling out over the land of Israel over a period of another 150 years. There's 27 specific predictions in Daniel chapter 11 in 35 verses, all of which are precisely fulfilled to the letter. Hundreds and hundreds of years after Daniel wrote this. So much so that you go to any respectable seminary that doesn't believe the Bible, and they'll tell you that clearly everybody knows Daniel was written, hundreds of years after Daniel lived, because no one could write this stuff because it's so accurate. I would posit another argument that the God of the Bible is real, and he knows the end from the beginning. And that he actually is able to do it. Because there's another prophecy. This is the medium-term prophecies of Daniel chapter 11, this seesaw struggle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Martin Luther, He wrote about it. He spoke about it as the Israel being caught between the door and the hinges of two interlocking dynasties in this season. And out of it emerged this great Antichrist figure, this guy Antiochus Epiphanes, who came and just ravaged the land of Israel and slaughtered the priests and sacrificed a pig on the altar and put prostitutes in the temple and did all kinds of things. So much so that actually the Jewish people rose up in rebellion against him and actually were able to defeat him. That is what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. It's what the Jewish people celebrate on Hanukkah. Have you ever heard of Hanukkah? You know, Pastor Dre? That's what that's all about. It was just 150 years or so before the birth of Jesus. It's all here in Daniel. It's all here in Daniel. And the funny thing is when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found parchments from the book of Daniel, which we know predate Jesus because they're a good 150 years before Jesus came. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. God is the God of history. He knows the end from the beginning. These are the medium-term prophecies, and then there's these long-term prophecies of Daniel. The one that nobody can actually do anything with is this idea of, we're going to read about it a little bit next week in Daniel chapter 9, of there being 70 weeks. And this is a phrase, it's a Babylonian concept of a week of year, like 70 times 7 years. It works out to be 490 years, in case you're a little slow like me, you had to use a calculator. It's about 490 years, but then it depends whether you're using the solar year or the lunar year. And listen, there are books miles wide that try and debate this. But everybody comes to the agreement. About 500 years after the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, the Messiah, the Anointed One, is going to come. And you can run the dates, and it either takes you to Jesus' birth, Jesus' baptism, or Jesus' crucifixion. But it gets you right in the ballpark right there. And everybody knows that Daniel was written before that happened because Jesus had the book of Daniel in his hands at the time of Jesus. You see, the accuracy of prophecy, the accuracies of Daniel is connected to Daniel's integrity, to Daniel's excellence, to Daniel's wisdom, and Daniel's prayer life. God revealed things to Daniel that had never been revealed to anybody else and that still to this day baffle us. How did he know what he knew about the future? You see, it's not clear even to Daniel when he's writing these prophecies where they all fit. It's not clear how it's all going to come together, but one thing he realizes that in a season where the prophetic voice of God is going to go quiet, and it does. For 400 years, from the end of the Old Testament, from the last words of Malachi through to the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, there's a prophetic silence of 400 years. We speak about it. We sing about it in our Christmas carols at Christmas. There's this period of prophetic silence, but Daniel had given them a roadmap. Don't worry, don't worry, don't worry. God is in charge. God is in charge. God is in charge. He knows the future. When you see these things happen, don't fear. When you see these things happen, don't fret. When you see these things happen, recognize that I'm in charge of history and I'm working my plan. I'm working my kingdom. That in the end, my dominion and my rule will be lifted up above the rule of the kingdoms and the rulers of this earth because I'm God and they're not. And that's the message of Daniel. It's powerful. And like so many prophets in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and even the apostles in the New Testament, we see this principle as we go through these pages of Daniel. It's best described of climbing a mountain. Now, I come from a land where we don't really have mountains. We call them mountains, but you'd probably describe them as hills. So let's call it, rather than mountain climbing, let's call it hill walking. How about that? But I remember, you know, I've been to the Highlands of Scotland, and I remember I've been to the Lake District up in the northwest of England. I've been to Snowdonia. In fact, my cousin sent me a video yesterday, him and his family climbing Tryfan in Snowdonia. A beautiful video. If we had time, I'd show it to you, of them climbing up the shale rock faces up to the top of what we would consider a mountain. You'd probably consider a little foothill around here. But one of the things I remember as a kid, we were up in Scotland one time, and I was with my brother, and we were camping out by this loch, and we woke up early in the morning. We saw this hill. You know, we were right in this big valley, and there was a mountain right above us. And we're like, well, we could climb that. We'll wake up early in the morning, we'll go climb it. That's what you do when you're teenagers. There's a hill surely we have to climb it. That's what we do. And so we set out early, and we had like a bar of chocolate and maybe a bottle of water, something like that. And we climbed up the hill. And we're getting closer and closer and closer, and we see the summit, and we're like, we're nearly there, we're nearly there. And we get to the summit, and we realize it's not the summit. It's just a little ridge, and there's another summit, and we go another half hour, and then we get to this, and we're like, we're nearly there, and then we realize, no, we're not even anywhere close. It's another full summit. Have you ever done that? Have you ever climbed? And this is exactly what's happening. If you see this picture of the mountains here, you see there's all these summits, and they all look like they're bang on top of each other. They're right close to each other, that these peaks are right next to each other. And if you take another view of a mountain range from above, you'll see there's this huge chasm, a huge expanse between them. And this is how the prophets of old saw the future. They're looking at it through this telescope, and they see one peak and another peak, and they think that these things are happening together. The Old Testament prophets thought that Jesus' first coming, the Messiah's first coming and his second coming were the same event, and they were not the same event. We know that, because we've been here 2,000 years waiting for him to return. And so we know that it's not the same event, because they saw it from the perspective up front. They saw these peaks next to each other. We see it from a perspective. There's a huge valley of time in between these events that are going on. Daniel doesn't know where it all fits. He sees one great mountain peak before him and another higher peak rising behind that. The second one seems within touching distance. And it's described as, in the Bible, the term that's used is, or the term that we use, that preachers use or theologians use, is this prophetic foreshortening. That we know what's going to happen, we just don't know when. We can't quite get the timing right in our heads. And so over and over and over, Daniel is looking at this stuff, and it's perplexing him, and it's disturbing him, and it's confusing him. He says in Daniel 7:15, "As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious. The visions of my head alarmed me." Daniel 7:28, he says, "As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me. My color changed. I kept the matter in my heart." Daniel 8:27, "I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days." Daniel 10:8, "So I was left alone, and I saw this great vision, and no strength was left in me." You see, to contend in the place of prayer, as Daniel did, takes everything you've got. See, the hardest battle of Daniel's life was not standing before Nebuchadnezzar. It wasn't standing before Belshazzar. It wasn't being thrown to the lions. These were not the hardest battles of Daniel's life. The hardest battles of Daniel's life was contending on his knees before those open windows in prayer. Because in the midst of it, to stand in the midst of Babylon is one thing, but to see clearly into the future is a totally different thing. Yet in the midst of it, to realize that history is written by the one who holds the future in his hands. And so Daniel didn't just see a vision of the future. He also didn't just see the immediate peaks ahead of him. But over and over again through the book of Daniel, we see this phrase emerging time and again, the time of the end. And in Daniel chapter 7, if you want to turn there with me, we see it begins with this the second part of the book of Daniel really begins with this vision, this ghastly vision. It's not a dream that a king has, it's a vision that Daniel has. And it's a vision of these incredible beast kingdoms of man. Earlier this spring, we actually spoke about them because they re-emerge again in Revelation 13 almost exactly. They're described almost exactly in Revelation 13. We see this beast emerging out of the sea of the nations, standing on the shore of the sea, being driven with hatred of the Jewish people and of the nation of Israel. This fierce beast with a lion like with wings and a bear and a flying leopard and this other kind of beast, and he sees these visions, and he sees that there's an end to history where all the bad things that have happened on earth, all the bad attributes of all the kingdoms of this earth are going to combine in one almighty, terrible time on the face of the earth. He calls it in Daniel chapter 12 a time of trouble. Jesus picks up on that himself when he's talking to his disciples in Matthew 24. He speaks about a time of trouble such as never been nor ever will be on the face of the earth. John speaks about it in this vision he has on the island of Patmos, a time of great trouble. Verse 27 of Daniel 7, it says this, he shall speak words. He's speaking about this, the primary spokesperson of this beast kingdom. The person that John in Revelation describes as the final great beast of history, the final great antichrist or false messiah of history. It says this in verse 25 of Daniel chapter 7, he shall speak words against the Most High, and he shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time's time and half a time. You speak words against the Most High. There's a season at the end of history where the brazen defiance of the kingdom of Babylon will rise to defy the very person and work of God. It's not as though we're living in a world where people deny the existence of God anymore. We're living in a world where people believe there's a God. We just don't care. That's the problem. 50, 60 years ago, the problem was a problem of atheism. But honestly, nanoscience and our idea of astronomy has ended that debate. We know there's a God. I mean, you can't look at the cell of a human being. You can't go down to the molecular level, nor can you look at the stars and actually seriously, credibly argue there is no God anymore. If scientifically, it is impossible to argue there is no God. Because we know so much about the complexity of this universe now. It just cannot be. It is impossible for it to have come about by chance. The problem of our generation is the world knows there's a God. We just don't care. And we don't want to serve him. And this is the defiance that is spoken of here in Daniel chapter 7. He shall speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the laws, and the saints of God shall be handed over to him. More bold, more defiant, more filled with pride, filled with intimidating words and threats, with this power to change our basic notions of right or wrong, of male or female, of freedom, of slavery. And he made war with the saints and prevailed over them. It's an incredibly disturbing vision that Daniel has. And my question for you is, how can you live with such a vision of the end? How can you stand with such a recognition of this trouble that is coming upon the face of the earth? Well, the answer is found at the end of Daniel chapter 12, and it's also found in the middle of Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to read a little bit from Daniel chapter 12. I included it in your notes. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who is charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. If God gives Daniel a vision of the future to remind his people that during this 400-year period of silence between the Babylonian exile and the arrival of Jesus on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, if God gives him such visions to remind them that he's in charge of world events and that he cares about their everyday lives, then these visions of the end are for the same purpose. For us, for today. That we would know that he who is over, who sits above the circle of the earth, is over the affairs of man, and he's in charge, and nothing takes him by surprise. Because we know that trouble's coming, but we know that God is able to hold us. God is able to protect us. God is able to sustain us through it, even in the brave new world of 21st century Babylon. Daniel chapter 7, I'm going to close with this. As he's seen the first of these awesome, terrible visions, Daniel sees something else. He's not just seen a vision of the future. He's not just seen a vision of the end, but he's seen a vision of the unending one. And as I looked, verse 9, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued, and it came out from before him. Thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Verse 13, and I saw in night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, and the glory and a kingdom of all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. And his dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. You see, as Daniel sees all these things, these visions of the future, these visions of the present, these visions of the end, he sees something else. He sees one seated on the throne. He sees one who is over and above all the affairs and all the events of humanity. He gets his perspective shifted from what's going on down here to what's going on up there. And the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his hair like pure wool. We see the same image actually in Revelation chapter 1. For those of you who remember us back in January, we're talking about it. Fire streams out from his presence. And the court sits in judgment, and he opens the book. Why? To demonstrate that he is able to justly judge the people of the earth. That the wicked won't get away with their wickedness forever. That the righteous will not remain under the boot of the wicked forever. That there is a time when God will right the wrongs. And God will restore justice on this earth. And God will care for the people that He has called and that He has called to His own. And there came one, verse 13, like the Son of Man, and to Him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom. You see, there is an unseen kingdom that exists even amidst all the visible kingdoms of Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome. You see, the book of Daniel describes in detail the kingdoms of man and the glory of the kings of the earth and the machinations of the conquests and the fights and the wars between the empires of the day. But there's another kingdom that stands behind. There's another kingdom that is not quite yet visible, but is there throughout the book and it's the kingdom of God and the kingdom of His Christ and the kingdom of those who are willing to give their lives for the sake of the King. We see the visible kingdoms of man, of power and wealth and intimidation and control. These kingdoms are not the ones who control history. History is controlled by the one who sits upon the throne, the one who opens the book, the one to whom we are all held account. And throughout the book of Daniel, we come face to face with the king of this kingdom. My kingdom, he said, is not of this world. He actually said these words. Jesus said these words face to face with the Roman governor in the governor's palace while he's on trial with the death penalty. In the courtyard in Jerusalem. Pilate comes to him and he says, you're a king, you're accused of being a king. And Jesus looks him in the eye and he says, my kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise my people would have been fighting for it. But for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I've come into the world. This is there in John 18. What purpose? The purpose to bear witness to the truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, Jesus said. And how is he going to bear witness to the truth? He's going to bear witness by dying on a Roman cross. And when he dies on that Roman cross, when he is suspended naked between heaven and earth, beaten, bloodied, bleeding, parched, shamed, humiliated, unrecognizable as a human, that his face so beaten beyond recognition. In that moment, he defeats the kingdoms of men. He calls time on the kingdoms of men, and he lets the invisible hidden kingdom come to the fore. You see, he breaks. We see it in Daniel chapter 2. There's an unhewn stone that doesn't look like much, that destroys the colossus of gold and silver and bronze and iron. Just destroys it, just obliterates it. Why? Because the God of heaven is King of kings, and his kingdom has no end. The kingdoms of man, they all have an expiration date. The rule of man all has an expiration date, but the kingdom of God has no expiration date. This hidden kingdom is breaking out. And we enter it by fixing our eyes upon this broken, bleeding, blood-stained body hanging on a cross for you and me. The one who took my guilt and took my shame invites me into his kingdom. It's a different kingdom. It's not a kingdom of success or power or wealth. It's a kingdom that will last forever. It's a kingdom that will have riches that we can't even comprehend. But it's a kingdom that requires that we serve. We give our lives fully in the service of that King. His kingdom should be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve him. It says in verse 27, the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. You see, when you serve the unending one, and when you participate in the unseen kingdom of the King of Kings, when you allow that kingdom to penetrate your hearts, what happens is God has a bridgehead in this earth. You see, there's people in this earth, even though the world is running to and fro. Remember in Daniel chapter 12, it says there's going to be a time at the end where people are running to and fro at such speed that we can't comprehend it. Do you realize I could get on a plane today and be the other side of the globe by breakfast? There's never been a season where people can run to and fro the way Daniel describes in Daniel chapter 12, like there is now. Knowledge shall increase to a degree that has never been conceived of on the planet. Every single one of you has a device in your pocket. You can learn anything about anything, anywhere in the world this instant. There's never been a season where the speed of our movement and the degree of our knowledge has been so high in the course. Daniel 12 is written for today. And how are you going to withstand in the season of the end? In the season that Daniel is, well, because there's a loyal remnant who's loyal to the king. This faithful few. And Daniel says, they who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. Why? Because when the darkness increases, the light shines so much more. That they will turn many to righteousness, like the stars that shine forever, forever. They will purify and make themselves white. They're willing, it says in verse 10 of Daniel chapter 12, they're willing to be refined. They are wise and they seek to understand. The divisions of the future and the trouble of the present pales into complete insignificance before the vision of the Ancient of Days, who's taken his seat, and who the kingdoms of the world belong to him. The worship of the earth belongs to him. He is a name that is high and lifted up above all the other names of all the other kingdoms on earth. And he invites us to worship him. He invites us to fix our eyes on him. And that's how we get to stand in Babylon. That's how we get to thrive in Babylon, with our eyes fixed upon the one who is unending, who is everlasting, and whose kingdom will never be defeated, because his name is higher than any other name. Lord Jesus, we thank you that you would help us, your people, to stand in the season that you've called us to stand. Lord, not to be intimidated by the vision of the future, but to have our eyes fixed upon the vision of the King. Because the Ancient of Days has taken his seat, and he's opened the books, and he's inviting each one of us to make sure that our names are written in those books, that our lives are lived in obedience to the King of Kings, in service of this hidden kingdom that is breaking out in this room all around us. because you're the Lord above all. You're the ruler of all the nations. There's no other name by which men may be saved but the name of Jesus. We thank you.